He used to think the trains were magic. Big iron beasts rumbling over the tracks, shaking the ground so hard it made his ribs hum. Isaiah Turner would sit cross-legged in the dirt, a thin boy with too much curiosity and not enough to eat, and he'd watch the cars roll by like they were carrying secrets. Every morning before school, he slipped out with a pocketful of hope, waiting for the whistle that meant the world was still moving, even if his little corner felt stuck. That morning in August, the air was already heavy with heat. It pressed down on his shoulders and made the grass crisp under his shoes. He'd just spotted a gleam of copper wire near the tracks when he heard the tires crunching gravel behind him. He froze. A black sedan pulled up, coughing out two sheriff's deputies in tan uniforms. Isaiah knew better than to stare, but his eyes wouldn't look away. One of the deputies wiped sweat from his neck and turned to the man they'd dragged out of the back seat. He looked tired, like he'd already lived 10 lives. His hands were up, palms open, like that could protect him from the hatred that had chased him down this road. Isaiah felt his own hands start to shake. He didn't know the man's name, but in that moment, he understood him. Understood that fear wasn't something you chose, it found you, latched onto your bones, and made you small. The deputy with the thick mustache said something Isaiah couldn't hear. The man tried to speak. His lips moved, but no sound came. Out. And then the other deputy raised his pistol. Isaiah pressed a fist to his mouth. He prayed they would just take the man away. Maybe beat him, maybe lock him up, anything but what he felt in the pit of his stomach. A gunshot cracked through the air. It sounded louder than thunder. The man fell backward, arms still in the air, like he was reaching for something he'd never touch again. The deputies didn't look around. They got back in the sedan, slammed the doors, and drove off like they'd tossed out trash. For a long time Isaiah didn't move. His heart was trying to crawl out of his chest. He couldn't feel the heat anymore, just the cold that crawled up his spine and sat there, whispering that nothing he believed about safety was true. He thought of his mama at home, hands raw from scrubbing floors that would never belong to her. He thought of his daddy, locked away for something he didn't do, because no white man in that courthouse believed a black man could be innocent. He picked up the copper wire, even though it felt wrong to move at all. He slipped it in his pocket and turned away from the body. His legs didn't want to work, but he made them. Every step home felt like stepping deeper into something he didn't have words for. When he reached the porch, he stopped. He couldn't bring himself to open the door. He was afraid if he looked his mama in the eye, she'd see everything. She'd see the part of him that had died by those tracks, the part that still thought maybe the world could be fair if you were good enough. The screen door creaked. His mama's face appeared in the doorway. She looked tired, like she always did after the judge's house. But when she saw him, something in her gaze sharpened. "Isaiah," she said, soft as a lullaby. "What happened to you, baby?" He didn't answer. He didn't have the words. He just pressed his hand to his chest, feeling his heart pounding so hard it hurt. She stepped forward and pulled him close. For a moment, he let himself be a child again, small enough to hide in her arms. But he knew the truth now that no matter how tight she held him, there were things in this world that could take him away. Things that didn't care about his dreams, or her prayers, or the love that had kept them alive this long. His cheek pressed against the soft fabric of her apron. He closed his eyes and tried to believe that someday, somehow, there would be a place where little black boys could watch the trains without learning to fear the men who drove up behind them. You're listening to Injustice Voice. My name is David. If this story grips your heart even a little, please subscribe to the channel. Leave me a comment below, tell me what you think, or share your own story of strength. That morning by the tracks would follow Isaiah for the rest of his life. But right then, he was just a boy clutching a piece of copper wire, trying to understand how the world could be so cruel and so beautiful all at once. Ruth Turner never planned to be a woman who bowed her head. But life had a way of pushing you. Down until looking up felt dangerous. Every morning before dawn, she tied her hair back and slipped into her faded dress. She kissed Isaiah's forehead while he pretended to sleep, though she knew he was always awake, listening for the door. She walked the mile to the judge's mansion with her shoulders square and her hands clenched in her pockets. It was the only way she knew to keep the fear from showing. The mansion rose out of the dust like something out of another country. Tall columns, white stone, polished brass. Sometimes Ruth caught her own reflection in those brass fixtures' skin. Dark as the earth, eyes rimmed with fatigue, and she wondered how much a person could lose before she stopped recognizing herself. Inside, the floors gleamed so bright it hurt to look at them. She scrubbed them anyway, on her knees, the brush biting her palms until they were cracked and raw. In the dining room, the judge liked to leave cigar ashes on the rug, just to watch her clean them up. He would stand by the window, talking to the sheriff about colored folks who didn't know their place. She kept her eyes low, but her ears never stopped working. She heard every word about the raids, about the names on their lists, about the plans they'd made for the ones who dared to speak up. Some nights she couldn't sleep for the dread. She'd see Isaiah's face in her dreams, smudged with soot and fear, and she'd wake with her heart thumping so loud it felt like a warning. But Ruth had never been the sort to let fear finish the fight. When she was sure the judge was gone, she slipped into the study. In the bottom drawer, he kept newspapers from Birmingham, the ones he'd confiscated so no one would see the protests. She folded them flat and hid them in her apron. At home, she tucked the papers into the flour jar. Isaiah would pretend not to notice, but every night she'd catch him peeking at the headlines. She'd sit him down at the rickety kitchen table, the two of them reading by lamplight until their eyes blurred. "Don't you ever think your mind isn't worth something?" she'd whisper, tapping her finger on the paper. "They can take a lot from you, but they can't take what you know." He'd nod, trying to look braver than he felt, and she'd pretend not to see how his hands trembled. There were days she thought about leaving Alabama altogether, just taking Isaiah and disappearing north. But then she'd remember Elijah, her husband, taken in the middle of the night for a crime no one ever proved. She'd remember how they'd said he fit the description, how the judge signed the papers without blinking. So she stayed. Because if she ran from every hateful man in that town, she'd never stop running. One afternoon, she was polishing the judge's silver when the sheriff swaggered in. He was laughing about the man they'd left by the tracks. Ruth felt something break in her chest. A small, clean snap. She didn't let her hands shake. She didn't let her eyes rise. She just kept polishing, slower this time, like every motion was a prayer. When she got home that night, Isaiah was waiting on the porch. He had that look like he'd been standing guard all day. She reached out and brushed the hair from his forehead, thinking how he was getting too tall, how the world was already taking bites out of his spirit. He looked up at her. "Mama, do you think it's always gonna be like this?" She swallowed the answer that tried to come. The easy lie. That everything would get better. Instead, she told him the only truth she could stand to say, "Maybe it will, baby. Maybe it won't, but you don't let them decide who you are." That night, when Isaiah finally slept, she sat by the window with a pencil and scrap of paper. She wrote a letter to a man she'd never met, a pastor in Birmingham who was helping people find lawyers. She didn't know if the letter would ever get there, but she needed to do something, anything, to feel like she still had a say in her own life. Outside, the cicadas buzzed like they always did. Inside, Ruth's hand shook as she signed her name. But the shaking didn't matter, because when she folded that letter and slipped it into her apron, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Small, battered, but alive. And that was enough to keep her breathing. Enough to keep her from bowing her head. The fire didn't start with a roar. It began with the smell of something wrong. A bitter, greasy smoke that slipped under the door and coiled around Isaiah's dreams. He woke to darkness, his heart already racing. "Mama!" His voice cracked from the smoke. "Mama, wake up!" Ruth was already stumbling into his room, her eyes red, her hair loose around her face. She grabbed his hand so tight it hurt. Flames flickered at the far end of the hall, climbing up the old wallpaper like orange fingers. They ran. They didn't have time for shoes, for the bag she kept packed under the bed, for the photograph of Elijah she'd hidden behind the pantry shelves. Every step felt too slow. Every breath burned. When they burst out the front door, the heat shoved them into the yard. Isaiah turned back, just in time to see the curtains ignite in the living room window. And standing in the street, half lit by the fire's glow, was the sheriff. He didn't move, didn't shout, just watched. His arms were folded over his chest, like this was nothing but a chore to be done. Ruth's chest heaved. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Isaiah looked up at her and saw the terror she'd always tried to hide. He felt it sink into him, heavy as the smoke. Neighbors stood behind their curtains, pale faces peeking through cracked glass. No one came out, no one carried a bucket or called for help. It was like they'd all agreed this was how things were supposed to be. The flames roared higher. The porch collapsed in a spray of embers. For a second, Isaiah thought he heard his daddy's voice calling from the fire, but he knew it was just the past echoing in his head. He felt something snap inside him, the same clean break his mama had felt polishing that silver. The part of him that still thought being good could save you. That if you stayed quiet, kept your head down, didn't cause trouble, you might be spared. Ruth pulled him back as the heat washed over them. Her hand shook where it clutched his arm. She was crying now, silent tears that left clean tracks on her sooty skin. He looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't see just his mother. He saw a woman who had been fighting her whole life, who had lost almost everything and still kept standing. She whispered, voice raw, "They can burn this house to the ground, Isaiah, but they can't burn us." He wanted to believe her. He tried to believe her. But as the roof caved in, something in him felt scorched and hollow. They stood there until the fire burned itself out. Until the sheriff finally turned and drove away without a word. Until the dawn came creeping over the trees, showing what was left. A pile of blackened boards, and the memories that hadn't turned to ash. Isaiah's feet were blistered from running barefoot through the yard. His throat was raw. But he didn't cry. He just stared at the ruin, thinking how everything he'd ever known could be taken in one night because of the color of their skin. Ruth touched his cheek, her hand trembling. "We can't stay," she whispered. "They'll come again. Next time, they won't wait for us to get out." He nodded. He was tired of pretending he didn't understand. As the sun rose, casting long shadows over the smoldering wreck, Isaiah felt something new stir in the space where fear used to live. It wasn't hope yet, but it was close. It was the knowledge that if he survived this, nothing could ever make him bow his head again. And he swore, standing barefoot in the ashes, that he would remember every face behind those curtains, every man who did nothing, every man who watched, because one day, when he was strong enough, he would make sure none of them ever forgot what they'd done. The train north was cold and smelled of stale tobacco. Isaiah pressed his forehead to the window and watched Alabama slide away. He thought he'd feel lighter leaving that place behind, but all he felt was hollow, like he'd left something of himself in the ashes. Ruth sat beside him, her hands folded tight in her lap. She didn't say much, just stared straight ahead, with her jaw clenched. He knew she was thinking about Elijah, wondering if he was alive somewhere or buried under a number instead of a name. They reached Chicago just before dawn. The station was bigger than anything Isaiah had ever seen, a cavern of echoes and strangers. Ruth's cousin Sarah met them by the benches. She hugged Ruth so hard they both started crying. Right there in front of everyone. Sarah lived in a red brick building that smelled of boiled cabbage and floor polish. Isaiah counted 4 locks on the front door and understood that fear didn't disappear just because you crossed a state line. They were given a room off the kitchen. The walls were thin, and at night Isaiah heard the building sigh and creak, like it was alive and full of secrets. Ruth started work in a packing factory within 2 days. The first night she came home with her hands wrapped in rags, eyes red from exhaustion. Isaiah tried not to ask too many questions. He knew she was carrying enough already. School felt like a punishment. The first morning he walked into the classroom. 20 pairs of eyes followed him to his seat. The teacher didn't even look up from her roll sheet, just mumbled his name like it was something she'd rather not bother pronouncing. At recess, some of the white boys circled him. One leaned in close and whispered, "You think you're better than us, coming up here from your jungle?" His breath smelled of sour milk. Isaiah clenched his fist but didn't swing. He'd already learned that fighting back only proved their point. When the bell rang, he slipped away to the basement, where the old science lab stood dark and forgotten. Most of the equipment was broken, cracked beakers, wires snarled like nests. But to Isaiah, it looked like possibility. He started going there every day after school. He'd spend hours cleaning the counters, organizing jars, wiping dust from metal boxes no one cared about anymore. He felt safer in that room than anywhere else. One afternoon, the janitor caught him there. Mr. Charles was a tall man with salt and pepper hair and eyes that missed nothing. Isaiah braced for another scolding. But Mr. Charles just leaned against the doorframe, watching. "You know what you're doing with all that junk?" he asked. Isaiah swallowed. "Some of it, not all." Mr. Charles nodded slow. "I used to fix radios. Back when a man could get work without someone reminding him where he came from." He stepped inside and opened a drawer. From it, he pulled a battered toolbox, the leather handle worn smooth by time. He set it on the counter like an offering. "Use these," he said. "Better in your hands than gathering dust in mine." Isaiah ran his fingers over the latches. For a second, the weight of everything, the fire, the men in the street, the taunts lifted just enough for him to breathe easy. That night, Ruth came home to find him bent over a transistor radio, the parts spread out like a map. She didn't ask where he'd gotten the tools. She just set her lunch pail down and watched him work, her eyes soft for the first time in weeks. "You really think you can fix that thing?" she asked. He didn't look up. "I know I can." She smiled, tired, but proud. "Then you do it, Isaiah. You fix it. You fix everything they broke." In that cramped apartment, with the factory grime still clinging to her hair and her hands bleeding through the bandages, Ruth believed in him, and that was enough to make him believe in himself too. He didn't know what waited for them in this city. He didn't know if things would ever get easier. But he knew he was done hiding in corners. He was going to build something they couldn't burn. Something that would shine so bright, no one could pretend not to see it. Even if he had to start with nothing but broken wires and a borrowed toolbox. Isaiah never told anyone how many nights he lay awake, picturing the men with the gasoline cans, picturing the sheriff's cold stare. He'd lie in that narrow bed off the kitchen and feel the old fear rising in his throat like smoke. But every morning he got up anyway. At 16, his hands were steady in a way his heart wasn't. In the science lab shadows, he felt almost invisible, almost free. He scavenged every piece of wire, every copper coil, every bolt that still had a bit of life in it. He taught himself to read the diagrams from a cast-off physics book, tracing each line with a finger until he understood how current moved, how resistance bent energy to its will. That lab became his refuge. The only place he wasn't the boy from Alabama with the burned-down house. The only place he wasn't a threat or a burden or a ghost. When he finally finished the generator, it looked like nothing special. A wooden frame propped on a metal plate. A wheel he'd salvaged from an old sewing machine, wires braided tight like rope. But when he spun the handle, the bulb flickered to life. A small, warm glow. His breath caught in his throat. For a moment, he forgot every cruel word, every shove in the hallway, every door slammed in his mama's face. This light was his. He worked late that night, testing the output, measuring the current. The janitor, Mr. Charles, found him hunched over his notes and whistled low. "You built that from scraps?" Isaiah nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "Boy, you got something special," Mr. Charles said. "Don't you ever let them tell you different." Isaiah tried to smile, but he was scared to believe it. Because believing meant there was something worth taking again. And he'd lost too much already. The next morning, his science teacher, Mr. Harland, saw the generator sitting on the counter. He picked it up with both hands, turning it over like it might sprout wings. "Where did you get this?" he demanded. "I built it," Isaiah said. Voice low. Mr. Harland looked at him a long time, as if trying to decide whether to laugh or applaud. Then he did something Isaiah didn't expect. He set the generator down with care. "You're going to enter this in the Citywood contest," he said. "I'll help you with the paperwork." Isaiah's stomach lurched. He hadn't thought that far. He'd only ever built things for himself to prove he could. To have something no one could take away. That night, he walked home in a daze. Ruth was in the kitchen, soaking her blistered hands in a bowl of cold water. When he told her, she didn't speak for a long time. Then she lifted her eyes to his. They were tired but fierce. "Don't you be afraid of being seen," she said. "They already hate you for breathing. Might as well give them a real reason." He tried to nod, but his chest felt tight. A week later, on his way back from the lab, he cut through the alley behind the school. He didn't see them waiting. 3 boys stepped out of the shadows. The biggest one held a knife. "Think you're smart, don't you?" The boy sneered. "Think you're better than us." Isaiah's mouth went dry. He didn't know if he should run or stand still. The boy pressed the flat of the blade against his chest, just enough to make the point. "You don't belong here," he whispered. "Remember that." Isaiah didn't remember walking home. He only remembered the heat of the knife and the way the world seemed to narrow around that single, hateful voice. When he pushed open the door, Ruth looked up from the table. She saw his face and went very still. "What did they do to you?" she asked. He shook his head, unable to speak. She stood and crossed the room, took his face in both her hands. Her palms smelled of soap and metal and work. "You listen to me," she sighed, her voice rough. "If you let them shame you, they win. If you let them scare you into hiding, they win twice." Her eyes shone in the dim light. "You hear me, Isaiah?" He swallowed, nodded. The next morning, he woke before dawn. He put on his cleanest shirt. He carried the generator all the way across town in a box lined with an old quilt. His heart thudded. With every step, he thought of the men who burned his home, the sheriff who turned away, the boys with the knife, and for the first time, he felt something close to defiance. They could call him names. They could threaten his life. But they couldn't make him shrink. He was going to walk into that auditorium. He was going to show them all what a boy from Alabama, a boy with nothing but scraps, could build. Even if his hands shook the whole time. The auditorium smelled like varnish and old paper. Rows of folding chairs stretched to the back wall, filled with parents in good coats and teachers with clipboards. Isaiah stood near the edge of the stage, gripping the wooden box like it was the only thing holding him up. His name was printed on a little card in front of the generator, Isaiah Turner. He wondered how many people read it and saw a curiosity instead of a boy. Ruth sat in the 3rd row, her hands folded tight over her purse. She looked so small in that big room. But when their eyes met, he felt something steady pass between them, like a promise neither of them had spoken out loud. The judges walked by each exhibit, murmuring to one another. Some nodded politely and moved on. Others paused to look closer. When they reached his table, the oldest judge, a man with a gray mustache, tilted his head. "You built this yourself?" Isaiah cleared his throat. "Yes, sir. From salvaged parts." "Show me." He set the box on the floor, knelt, and turned the crank. The bulb blinked once, then glowed, soft and sure. He felt every eye in the room slide over him, weighing, measuring. He thought of the night in the alley, the knife pressed to his chest. He thought of the fire and the sheriff's cold stare, and then he looked at the bulb and felt something close to peace. This was proof. No matter what they called him, he had done this. The judges moved on. The minutes crawled. Someone announced the winners over a crackling microphone. When they called his name, it didn't feel real. Ruth clapped a hand over her mouth. She didn't stand at first. She just stared at him, eyes wide, as if she was seeing the boy she'd dreamed of when he was still in her belly. The boy she knew he could be if the world didn't break him. He walked to the stage. Every step felt like walking out of a tunnel he'd been in for years. A tunnel of fear, of hunger, of shame. When they handed him the certificate, he took it with both hands. His voice shook as he spoke into the microphone. "My mama taught me that if you know something, no one can take it from you." He looked down at her. She was standing now. Tears tracked down her cheeks, but her chin was high. "She taught me that the truth matters more than fear." The applause started slow, scattered. But it grew, and Isaiah felt something lift off his shoulders. Something he hadn't known he was still carrying. Afterward, reporters crowded him, asking questions he could barely hear over the pounding in his chest. "Who helped you? Where are you from? What do you want to be?" He answered as best he could. But inside he was thinking of the boy by the tracks, of the fire that left them with nothing, of the boys in the alley who tried to make him disappear. He thought of how every one of those moments had carved him into the person standing here now. When the last flashbulb popped, he stepped down from the stage. Ruth met him halfway, her arms opening. He let her hug him even though he was nearly grown. He buried his face in her shoulder and breathed her in. Soap and sweat and something sweet he couldn't name. "You did it," she whispered. "Oh, Isaiah, you did it." He pulled back and looked her in the eye. "So did you," he said. They walked out of the auditorium together. The late afternoon light felt brighter than it should have been. He carried the certificate under one arm, the generator in his other hand. On the sidewalk, a woman with a little boy stopped to stare. She smiled, just a small thing, but real. "That's him," she murmured to the child. "The boy who won." Isaiah didn't look away. He wanted that boy to see him, to know you could be scared and still stand tall. You could lose everything and still find a way to build. They rode the bus home in silence, too tired to speak. But when they stepped off at their block, Ruth touched his shoulder. "Isaiah, do you feel it?" He thought for a moment. He closed his eyes and breathed deep. "Yes," he said finally. "I feel it." It wasn't that the world had changed. It hadn't. The same shadows waited on every corner. The same hate still crouched behind polite smiles. But he had changed. He knew now that no fire, no bullet, no knife could make him small. Again, he was a builder, a survivor, a boy who turned scraps into light. And one day, when he was a man, he would make sure every child who felt unseen would know this. No lie is stronger than the truth. No hate is stronger than a heart that refuses to bow. This is Injustice Voice. My name is David. If this story moved you, please subscribe to the channel. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Because every story like Isaiah's deserves to be heard, and every voice deserves to rise.